President Biden reportedly spoke with Puerto Rican Governor Pedro Pierluisi in the wake of Hurricane Fiona. Biden said they discussed federal personnel working to assist the island's recovery. The hurricane left the entire island out of power, which a local energy company said it could take days to resolve. Today, the FEMA administration will be in San Juan to assess urgent needs.
The intense flooding and winds left 1.4 million households in the dark, while nearly 200,000 people were left without drinking water. Now,
that's terrible, and obviously an island that's been hit a couple times recently.
Yeah, and seemingly with increasing frequency. Obviously, many people will point to this being the natural consequence of climate change, and that these kind of disasters are going to happen more and more and more at great cost and expense. There's also this conversation that's happening right now about what it means that an entire state worth of Americans is left without power and largely without water, without there being anywhere near the public outcry that you would expect if, Texas or New York or Wyoming or even a small state like Vermont had a similar catastrophe hit them, and then to hit them repeatedly.
Right.
And what's going to be different the next time something happens like this, which it absolutely will because of the nature of these weather events.
Well, I say this every time we talk about Puerto Rico, really in any context, but it's particularly appropriate for this subject. The Jones Act, which is this horrible 100-year-old protectionist U.S. law that when you're shipping goods from one American port to another American port, the ship must be American built, it must fly an American flag, and it must be American. It must have an American crew. Again, this is like Woodrow Wilson era policy. It's not. My understanding is it's not a huge deal for the land part of the country, the continental part, but it makes life worse for Hawaii and for Puerto Rico especially. It drives up their energy prices ridiculously. They're out of power right now. They have to overpay for, this is according to a report from the Cato Institute, the Jones Act forces Puerto Rico to vastly overpay for energy. So some of these continuing crises they have, yes, obviously climate change having a factor, but our policies are just immiserating this poor island. There's no, and this policy is suspended every time there's a disaster in Puerto Rico. The last time there was, the Trump administration waived it. Well, if we admit that it's so bad for Puerto Rico that when they're really under crisis, we're going to waive it, shouldn't we just get rid of it then? Shouldn't it not, under normal times, for the quote-unquote normal times, shouldn't they just be better off without it? It does nothing except protect like a small number of American ship manufacturers from legitimate competition, which used to be a goal of the American ship industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfectly legitimate criticism. I know there's also been a lot of conversation about the privatization schemes of the power in Puerto Rico, generally speaking, and the amount of debt that the country is in, partly as a consequence. Apparently the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority basically it's been underinvested in, and also, there's been privatization schemes, which, as we kind of saw in Mississippi, tend to make it so that people can extract wealth from these kind of schemes without investing for the long-term infrastructure projects, and it's happening all over the place. So there are some folks that are saying, well, what if Puerto Rico were a state? Can you imagine this happening to a state? And other folks have responded, well, it's happening in a state, in the continental United States, and that doesn't really seem to be what's going on here.
Puerto Ricans have, they've been sort of, they put it to a vote whether they would like to be a state or not, and they rejected that, right? They don't want the, I don't know, they like their own kind of quasi-self-governance.
Well, the argument, this is a bigger conversation, and we should definitely have, someone from Puerto Rico want to discuss, but the issue is that they're being presented with kind of, two choices, neither which is especially, there are people who make arguments that there are other ways to have more self-determined. Like the question is, if you become a state, are you still going to have these underlying issues? If you, a lot of people say, well, I don't want to be independent, not because I don't want to be independent, but because the feeling is that the country can't sustain itself without being a part of the American family / colony, however you want to describe it. And so are these constrained choices, or are these choices being made with the understanding of the poverty that the country is in and the lack of resources being given to actually have like a fair start after all of these years of being under America's protectorship.
Well, political commentators were quick to point out the media's ignorance on this topic. CNN's Ana Navarro Cardenas said, quote, "I respect the Queen as much as the next person. I offer my condolences to the Brits and all who loved her, but can I please get some news and footage of the effects of Fiona in Puerto Rico? For those who need reminding, they are American citizens in distress." Podcaster Dr. Jen Jackson tweeted, "White supremacy is the whole world focusing on the casket, funeral proceedings, and death of an imperialist monarch who symbolized colonialism, while countries populated by people of color and are underwater and without power." Well, that's a Briahna take.
How so?
I'm just speaking to the colonialism of the British Crown, something we've discussed on this show. I mean,
look, I think it could be the Queen, it could be any number of things, but it's obviously frustrating when the news decides not to focus on major crises because of some kind of spicy, more media style.
But what do you mean focus on? I'm sure this is being covered in every outlet. Like, just because you haven't seen enough tweets about it doesn't mean it's not being covered.
No, apparently not. I mean, I'm not a cable news viewer, but the feedback that I've seen is that there have been live streams of the Queen and her casket and her funeral procession and a great deal of coverage of it as compared to Puerto Rico. Now, I will say I'm not a real cable viewer, but when I turn my TV on, if I don't immediately open one of the apps, it defaults to playing the news. And every time it did that over the course of the weekend, it definitely was live streams and looping conversations about the Queen and her legacy. I feel like I've seen her give that speech in South Africa a million times just because of the autoplay function on my, like streaming device. So I think that's a legitimate complaint. You don't think that's true?
I mean, I'm sure if their viewers wanted to watch more coverage of hurricanes, and that's what which they actually do cover national disasters.
Do you think market forces are dictating what's happening on the news, even though we've had so many conversations about how the mainstream media overfocuses on Russiagate and 1-6 and are losing subscribers as a consequence?
Well, but they've cultivated an audience who rabidly wants that kind of coverage at CNN and MSNBC. If you're talking about Russiagate,
do they? If they're losing subscribers all the time?
Well, there aren't enough of them, and they've committed to a bad strategy. But they actually, like, coverage of Queen Elizabeth's funeral is probably even much more broad, something like people will turn on to even who wouldn't generally watch the news, because people are genuinely interested. I'm surprised by, as an American who doesn't love the institution of the monarchy and never really cared about the royal family that much, I'm always surprised, but it seems to me to be the case that people are really invested in it, and they do want that kind of coverage.
And is that what should drive news coverage? What's the relationship between newsworthiness and collecting advertiser dollars?
I mean, a news organization that continuously shows or tells its viewer news that they care less about is just not going to succeed. So at the end of the day, it's pointless to complain about it.
Well, I think you also tell people, you help to let people know what is relevant by what it is that you cover.
Also, this is Ana Navarro. If it's so important, then CNN can do The View can do wall-to-wall coverage of. Well,
it's not just Ana Navarro. Right? A lot of people were echoing this sentiment, and I do think there's some important conversations to be had about what is motivating news coverage and whether or not a national disaster that has wiped out power for the entire state of Puerto Rico is something that should get more coverage than a foreign monarch passage at a healthy, ripe old age.
But people who have that problem can, especially if they're in the journalism industry, they can just be the change they want to see in the world and cover it as we are covering it.
Yeah, well, I hope to do a lot more Puerto Rico coverage this week.
Absolutely as well. More Rising right after this.